We have all these new technologies to discover what's going on in the brain. And what we've learned is, like you say, the prefrontal cortex is not where trauma is being stored. That's being stored in the deeper nonverbal, actually pre-verbal parts of the brain, the reptilian brain and the emotional brain. So what that means is basically all the years that we try to treat these things that have happened to people that are stored in the nonverbal parts of the brain, when you're trying to treat that only with talk therapy, you're never going to get there. That's like having a flat tire in your car and trying to fix it by adjusting the carburetor. You're not even working in the right system.
Yeah.
So Bessel van der Kolk's work has been focusing on all the ways to get into those other parts of the brain that are the nonverbal, the deeper levels of the brain. And that includes things like yoga.
I think that's so critically important. And it seemed like a lot of Bessel's work was with reconnecting with the body and reconnecting with individuals. Mm-hmm. So if I sit here with you and I'm present with you, mm-hmm. that we're kind of connected on some level. Mm-hmm. And that's very important. But it's also important for ourselves to feel connected with our own bodies in order to move past trauma. Yeah. So, any additional thoughts on recognizing sensations within mm-hmm. the body and maybe mm-hmm. rate at which somebody might want to progress through these things?
My background in yoga is almost exactly the opposite of most Westerners, which has given me a completely different perspective on it. I mean, I actually started studying the philosophy of yoga and practicing meditation, all the inner practices of yoga, the breathing work, the pranayama, all that sort of thing, in 1974. I didn't make it into an actual yoga class until about 1986. Mm-hmm. So by the time I actually made it into a yoga class, I already understood that there were much deeper levels of yoga than simply standing there and doing some postures. Mm-hmm. In fact, I understood that was probably the least consequential part of yoga. Mm-hmm. So therefore, I went into my first classes as a postural yoga type practice, already knowing that, most Westerners believe that yoga is this physical system of exercise that happens to have some mindfulness practices appended to it. Mm-hmm. But actually, the truth is the opposite of that. Yoga is a mindfulness practice that very recently has had some exercise movements attached to it as an add-on. But my position all along, the whole reason I even became a yoga teacher is because I met a lot of yoga teachers who knew how to teach asana. They knew how to teach the postures of yoga, but they didn't really know how to teach yoga. As far as I'm concerned, if you're not teaching yoga from a perspective of constantly reintroducing people to being focused on what's going on in their body, totally somatic based, totally mindfulness based, if you're not teaching them how to use the postures as a way to turn it into a form of moving meditation, you're not even really teaching yoga. You're teaching an exercise class with yoga affectation. So that's why I became a yoga teacher, because I wanted to make sure that people were really getting that deeper connection, that it's really about the practice of self-awareness and learning to redirect your attention inward. Bessel van der Kolk, he says that it was the understanding of this heart rate variability concept that helped him to originally move into some of these more somatic body-based kind of practices. And basically the concept means heart rate variability. If you have a good heart rate variability, what that means is the regulation of your breath quickly and immediately affects your emotional state. If you have a poor heart rate variability, then you can change your breathing rate and it'll still affect your emotional state, but it'll take longer for that to happen. Mm-hmm. And what he's learned is that unfortunately a lot of people with trauma, we're talking about usually severe trauma in some of these situations, people have learned they're in a panic state so often that they tend to have really shallow breaths. And so they tend to have poor heart rate variability. It turns out that you can teach people to have better heart rate variability through breathing exercises. So here we are back to pranayama, the practice of breathing. In India, we learned the benefits, all the things you can do with the breath thousands of years ago. And that's been, working with the breath has been a practice at least 2,000 years ago, probably longer than that. And like I said, the yogis learned that you can regulate yourself up or down by simply controlling your breath. And if you think about it, that's a pretty powerful tool. And it's such a powerful tool, and it's something that's so easy and all of us breathe every day. It's amazing that more cultures didn't go further into it, because there's really a few simple things you can learn that give you a lot of. I don't have problems with falling asleep anymore. I've learned pranayama techniques that allow me to, if I'm still a little wound up when I go to bed, I can wind myself down. I have pranayama practices. I can pick myself up if I need a juice and I don't want to go to another cup of coffee because I've had 3 that day and I don't need any more caffeine.
Yeah.
So these are pretty powerful tools. Like I said, there's all these. Yoga has uncovered so many incredibly powerful tools. I consider yoga to be the original technology of personal transformation. Mm-hmm. Compared to that, the field of psychology is the newcomer on the block.
Exactly.
But the field of psychology has a whole lot to learn, and I think we've only scratched the surface about all the cool things that you can get from the world of yoga that directly can improve our ability to help people with trauma or depression or anxiety or pretty much anything that we work with in this field.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. There are thousands of year-old practices, and we've been using it for a long time, but we're just now starting to get the technology to validate it. And I think that's really, really fascinating. The breath was also the bridge between like the past and the future. That they're saying if you're focusing on your breath, you're breathing in the present. It's much easier to stay in the present if you're focusing on something that can only be done in the present.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and like I said, this is well-established technology. We've had literally more than 2,000 years to study the way the breath can impact our states. The rules are fairly simple too. If you're wanting to calm yourself down, the easiest thing you can do is extend the length of time on the exhale. It's really that simple. Probably the most simple self-regulation technique you can do is I'll sometimes have somebody pay attention to their breath. Like you said, that immediately puts them into the present. You can't be thinking about what's happening tomorrow if you're focusing really on the breath. And then I'll invite them to try to regulate. So the exhale is about 50% longer than the inhale. And if you do that for even just a few breaths, you'll find that it calms you down. It's just part of it. In fact, you can even take that further. There's the 4-7-8 technique. Dr. Andrew Weil talks about, inhale to a count of 4, hold for a count of 7, exhale to a count of 8. That's taken that to sort of another level.
Yeah.
But like I said, that's one that on the basis of that technique alone, I no longer struggle with insomnia ever, because I know how to fix it, and it's that easy. It's really that easy. So there's all these different techniques. There's times when you need to, when the need is to regulate yourself up too. So there's ways. I also read Yoga for Depression by Amy Weintraub, and she talked about typically when you're doing the trauma-sensitive yoga, mostly you're looking at techniques to help people regulate themselves down. As a general rule, they're going to be revved up and they need to find a way to calm themselves down. But what are situations where you might want to regulate yourself up? And a good example would be depression or dysthymia or any type of depression specifically that has a lot of lethargy. If you fit that particular profile with your depression, then learning some simple practices to regulate yourself up can be very, very powerful. And yoga has lots of those.
I'm seeing a lot of connections here between things that therapists can teach clients, but also things that are just generally good for life. And you're saying, using breathing techniques to help with your sleep patterns, again, something that's kind of at home. The military uses box breathing, which is like the 4-4-4 type breathing. And that we know that to perform optimally, we need to stay in the zone. So we need to have the right amount of arousal, not too much arousal. So we have some techniques that might be able to put us into the right range or pull us down into the right range. And that could have a serious impact, not just on your ability to withstand, a stressful event, but you might need to perform. You might need to perform at work, where if you could get yourself elevated or get yourself brought back down, that you would be able to deliver maybe that speech that you need to deliver, or whatever the case may be, without getting out of bounds of where peak performance happens.
Yeah, and speaking of the military, there's been a lot of work with something called yoga nidra, which is also called yogic sleep. So basically, it's a form of guided visualization where it's scripted. You can talk somebody through a visualization that allows them to get very, very relaxed. And there's the person that did Richard Miller, the person that did a lot of research into that, worked in the VA hospital system. So most of the research into his particular type of yoga nidra, it's called iRest, was mostly with military veterans who needed to learn to regulate themselves down. And the thing you have to understand is that, there's an entire spectrum of trauma, of course. I mean, first of all, there's nobody in the world that hasn't had some amount of trauma. There's nobody at 0 on the scale. But it's also important to understand that there's an enormous amount of difference in working with somebody who has trauma at a 60 on that scale versus somebody who's at an 85 or 90 on that scale. People on the 85 or 90% scale, often these people are just literally hyperstimulated all the time. So getting sleep is a problem for them because they're wound up all the time. They don't feel safe ever at any time. The power of being able to use some of these techniques to allow people to really fully rest, sometimes for the first time in years, is very, very transformative for them. And actually, Richard Miller's system has a lot of other tools beyond the actual scripts of a yoga nidra practice. But like I said, there's all kinds of techniques we can use for people of all walks of life and people with all kinds of disorders. People, different kinds of trauma, different kinds of depression, different kinds of anxiety. There's almost an unlimited supply of things that we can do to help people.
I've gone to a yoga class being not very familiar with it. I was one of 2 men that were in the class, mildly overweight going into it. So there's that feeling of not knowing. There's reasons to believe that maybe I don't belong here because there's environmental cues that would suggest that might be the case. The one other gentleman that was in the room looked like he belonged there. Like he was super limber. He was very kind of into it. So my mind, I was telling myself a story while I was doing this. And then after it was over, for one, everybody had gone through this. So we are all kind of in a different mind space. But it was a very welcoming environment on the back end. And that was being somebody that had a lot of reasons to feel that maybe this class wasn't right for me. I just thought that, I'd do this at home. Let's go see what this is like in a group setting. And it was an amazing experience. And it was very different ending that class than I thought that it would be.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, the world of yoga could do a better job of bringing in more diversity. People sometimes get the impression that if you're not a skinny white woman with no bones in your body, you're not really going to be able to benefit from a yoga class. And it's so people get messages that, that's unfortunate because really yoga can help everybody. And I'm very, very interested in making it as welcoming as possible for as many people as possible because I just literally believe that everybody in the world can benefit from yoga. I just literally believe everybody in the world should have yoga in their life because it does so much for you. It's so healthy on every level, mentally, emotionally, physically. And you can start at any point. I'm not in perfect physical shape myself. But like I said, I believe that there's a form that yoga is for everybody, but not every particular yoga practice is for everybody. You have to find one that you feel comfortable with.
I think that's perfect. Here's another thing that we talked about. There are varying different levels of trauma. And a lot of the poses in yoga can feel vulnerable. So you do trauma-sensitive yoga, and there are some people that might be a little bit further on the trauma scale that maybe a standard yoga class might be a little bit too much for them to assume. So how would a trauma-sensitive yoga class be different than what you might experience if you went to your local gym and joined a yoga class? Yeah,
well, again, it's fairly complicated. I mean, I spent about 8 months of monthly weekend trainings, getting that training. Basically, you set up a trauma-sensitive yoga class to be accommodative to that person that's at the 95% level. So if somebody comes in and their trauma's only at a 60 or 70%, it's still going to feel relatively safe for them. So in trauma-sensitive yoga, you do things like you have to create the safest environment you possibly can. I mean, for example, if you were doing it in a yoga studio, you couldn't have any straps showing anywhere. You'd have to put those away. If there's a door to the room and another door that's a closet, you'd want to make sure that they saw that that was a closet and the boogeyman can't come in while they're doing their practice and get them. You typically are going to practice the class in a circle, and you're going to do all the poses with them, whereas in a regular yoga class, I'm going to be at the front mirroring the postures. Again, you're taking into consideration those people who won't feel safe if there's somebody behind them. So everybody's in a circle, everybody can see what's going on. If somebody has to know where the door is and they have to see the door, they'll know to position themselves around the circle where they can see the door for safety. All about making it as safe as possible. So there's all those different ways that we would modify it to increase the level of safety. The bottom line is, if somebody's at a 85 or 90 or 95% on that scale, you can't eliminate all the triggers. You literally can't. These are people that are generally triggered most of their waking life. But you still do everything possible to make it safe. The idea being you want them to feel comfortable enough, you want them to see the effort you're putting in to make it safe so that they can allow themselves to open up and experiment with some of the techniques you're going to try to teach them to keep themselves calm and regulated.
Now, I know that a lot of this work isn't systematic desensitization, that it's more integration of ideas. But it does occur to me that if you're able to take it slow, and we're not necessarily trying to avoid a full trigger,
right?
But the way to build tolerance to those type of things is to be able to experience it in a level that you can handle,
right?
And am I right by making that assumption?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and although we don't call it systematic desensitization, that's a specific technique that we use in the behavioral health field. In a nutshell, that's the overarching plan with trauma-sensitive yoga. I can only speak to the EMBER model, which is the model I'm certified in. It even stands for mindfulness-based emotional resilience. So it's about developing resilience in your students and your clients. And the way they do that is absolutely, the EMBER model is taught in a curriculum. It's defined curriculum with defined stages. And stage one is simply comfort and safety, helping people to find a felt sense of comfort and safety, including some people who may have can't remember what a felt sense of comfort and safety even feels like. But doing everything possible to create a nurturing, safe environment. Stage two is to teach them to have an attitude of curiosity about the sensations that they have. Because if you realize, okay, this sensation feels really uncomfortable, but it's just a sensation, it won't kill me, and I can choose to sit with it and be mindfulness and be aware of what's going on with that sensation, then you're only a teeny little baby step away from being willing to, okay, now that I'm in here, I can try some of these regulation techniques just as an experiment. We'll approach it like a scientist, and we'll experiment and see what happens if I try these particular techniques. Now, once you get somebody to take that step, then you're into step three. This is where somebody's actively being with the sensations and actively practicing techniques that they choose to self-regulate. So the thing about trauma-sensitive yoga is that you're putting all the power 100% back into the hands of the person that has the trauma. Trauma-sensitive yoga acknowledges that I can't help somebody recover from trauma. They can help themselves recover from trauma. I can offer them the tools. But it really doesn't work until they feel empowered and they feel capable of using the techniques on their own. That's the path of eventually desensitizing themselves to the point where these things don't trigger them anymore. So when you talk about extinguishing those triggers, then you're talking about somebody who's actually cured their PTSD. They no longer have PTSD.